Well, hello folks, and welcome to our lesson on Chapter 3, which deals with one of the more, perhaps neglected is not the word that I'm looking for, one of the aspects of filmmaking that we don't tend to pay a lot of attention to, even though it significantly impacts how we do read a film, and that element is production design. So, whereas when we're talking about a film, very often we will focus on properties of film that are very specific to film, such as cinematography, such as editing, or properties of film that are amplified or made very obvious by film, such as acting, for instance. Acting is certainly amplified by close-up shots. Some elements of film meaning, like sound, and in this instance production design, fall by the wayside. People tend to not notice them as much, although they do have a significant impact on the way in which we read a film. So today we're going to talk about production design. So exactly what is a production designer responsible for? Well, basically, a production designer is responsible for pretty much everything you see in the film that is not actually an actor and is not actually a special visual effect. So the production designer is responsible for sets, the actual environment that the scenes of the film are captured in. The production designer is responsible for costumes, what people are wearing. The production designer is responsible for properties, so any objects that people interact with within the scenes of the film. So if an actor needs to move a chair, a production designer is responsible for the look and design of that chair. If it's a police film or an action film in which people are shooting at each other, the production designer is responsible for making sure that the actors have the appropriate guns. If it's a film about cooking, the production designer is responsible for making sure that the actors, I should say, have realistic looking pots and pans. So the production designer is responsible for everything you see in the frame that is not an actor and not a special visual effect. So, what does a production designer do? And as we've been stressing throughout the course, filmmaking is a collaborative art form. So, the production designer, as a film is being planned, usually in conjunction with the producers of the film, the producer is usually responsible for financing, and the director, as we've talked about in the course, is the person responsible for coordinating all of the elements of film meaning in the film, and the screenwriter as well, who will have prepared a script. What the production designer will first do, in collaboration with those other three people, take a look at the script, and having taken a look at the script of the film, will come up with an overall look for the film. So they're going to make some decisions about, for instance, period. What period is this film set in? Is it a contemporary film taking place in the city? Is it taking place in the country? Or is it taking place in the past? Is it taking place in the 18th century, the 15th century? Is it set in an urban area? Is it set in a rural area? Or is this a fantasy film? Are we inventing our own period? Are we saying that this is set on the planet Pandora 2,000 years from now? So the production designer will first visualize, in collaboration with the director and the producers and the screenwriter as well, will decide what the overall look of the film is going to be, what they hope to achieve, and then in collaboration with those three people, the production designer will set a budget for production design. What can we realistically do with the money that we are given? Once the production designer knows what the parameters she or he has to work within are, so what things need to look like, and basically how much money they've got to make that happen, production designer will then prepare sketches of everything, of sets, of costumes. again, of properties. So the production designer, again, in collaboration with the screenwriter, the producer, and the director, will start to come up with not just sketches of sets and costumes, but also storyboards, pre-visualizing the entire story. So think of a storyboard as something of having the same format of a graphic novel. So the production designer will make sketches of what all of the scenes will look like in a film, laid out in the order that the story of the film unfolds, detailing what all of the characters will be wearing and what all of the characters will be doing. So all of this is sketched out on a storyboard very thoroughly. Since the 1980s, it's also become a standard after storyboards to digitally pre-visualize what scenes and sets are going to look like. So in the early 80s, they did it with literally physical models and VHS tape. So there's a scene, for instance, in the Star Wars film Return of the Jedi. They wanted to there's a chase on futuristic sort of hovering motorcycles through a redwood forest, and the motorcycles are zipping in and out of this forest, and the chase is very cool. So they actually built a tabletop model of a redwood forest and then had little puppet figures on motorcycles on thick wires and moved them through the forest and filmed that on VHS just to get a sense of what the scene would look like. Nowadays, this can be done digitally with a computer. Once all of these decisions are made, the production designer, if exteriors are needed, goes out and actually scouts locations, looks for physical spots where they're going to shoot the film. If you ever are watching a video of a film's production, so you have a DVD, you've decided to look at the bits where they tell you how the film was made, the extras that you get, and you hear the director and the production designer talking about recce's, that's what these mean. They're actually going out and looking for physical places where the film can be shot. So we're all aware of the Star Wars and Indiana Jones films. One of the favorite locations that they keep returning to for those films is a canyon in Tunisia, which also figured very prominently in David Lean's film Lawrence of Arabia as well. They look for physical locations where they're going to shoot the film, and then finally the production designer supervises the production crew in constructing sets, costumes, environments, etc. So the production designer not only is literally the architect of everything you see in the frame in front of you, that is not an actor or not a visual effect, but the production designer is also the contractor. The production designer actually gets to implement this and put this all into place. Now, just to give you an example of why locations can be important particularly, here are a couple of stills from Julie Taymor's 1999 film, Titus. Now, Titus is a play by Shakespeare. It's set really at the fall of the Roman Empire, and Taymor, for the period of the film, decided in collaboration with her production designer, we're not going to set this in ancient Rome. We're going to set this in a contemporary location using contemporary costumes, even though the play itself is supposedly about the fall of Rome. Well, why did Taymor do this? Taymor was trying to draw parallels between the collapse of ancient Rome, between the fall of Rome, and our contemporary historical period, in which we're seeing, especially in the past 100 years, we've seen the collapse of monarchies and fascistic styles of governments and the rise of democracies. If you really think about it, in the year 1900, there were very few democracies on the planet. Most governments were still controlled by kings and queens. Fast forward 100 years, no more monarchies. We've got a lot of democracies. Now, many argue that democracy itself is currently threatened, but Taymor was trying to make a point about this film detailing the collapse of the Roman Empire, comparing the collapse of the Roman Empire many centuries ago to the collapse of monarchies and the collapse of fascism in the 20th century. So she went out and in collaboration with her production designer, asked the production designer to recce locations that would help to reinforce this idea. So, firstly, if you can see here, the costumes that people are wearing, you see here contemporary costumes. These people are wearing two-piece suits and a Roman guard in Roman uniform, which would have been a uniform that nobody's worn for 2,000 years. So again, costumes are being used as part of the meaning of the film itself, conflating the two historical periods. Tamor is saying, ancient Rome is now. We're going through the same issues. And now, if you look at the building that they're standing behind, this building is a very recognizable building to anyone in Europe. This is the EUR building in Rome, and the construction of the building was commissioned by Benito Mussolini in fascist Italy in the 1930s. And this building was Mussolini's crowning achievement, if you will, his statement of glory. Isn't fascism a wonderful thing? And fascism will bring the world together. So visually, we as an audience in 1999 actually know that fascism was not such a great thing, and fascism eventually collapsed. So Tamor is using the fact that we're visually aware of the significance of this building. It helps us to identify that what we're witnessing is the fall of fascism. And just to make sure you really get the point, notice these long black banners streaming out of the building as well. Again, both Mussolini and Hitler very fond of long streaming cloth banners coming across buildings. So the location of the film itself, even though it's not a constructed set, they've gone and shot on an actual location. The location of this film itself very much helps to convey the meaning that the filmmakers are trying to put across. So as I've said, the production designer is attempting to create a unified design for the film. What the production designer hopes to achieve is an interplay of all of the design elements within a single shot. So, the production designer has to decide what the layout of the sets will be, not just only because they want the film to look a certain way, but because the sets have to be practical. They have to be able to shoot within the set. So, sets are often designed with removable walls, or, for instance, a kitchen set might be designed with removable counters, so to achieve a different camera angle, you can actually remove a piece of the set and put the camera where a counter was formerly. So, the production designer will have to take all of that into account, what the layout of the set needs to be, and then we'll need to decide what architectural style and what building materials will best be used for that layout. And I'm going to talk about, in a second, an example of this called the volcano set. The production designer then needs to decide what the coloring and the texture of buildings, both interior and exterior, will be, and what the costumes will look like. Alright, so, in this case, of a James Bond movie, You Only Live Twice, the production designer, Ken Adam, was told the last scenes of this film are going to take place inside a hollowed-out volcano where the supervillains have actually constructed a launching pad so that they can launch satellites into space, which will have a disruptive impact on the Earth and allow them to achieve world domination. So here, this is the interior of the volcano. The production designer knows through the script that the volcano needs to have a fake lake inside of it, And the fake lake, I'm highlighting this with the cursor, is really a giant retracting door through which the supervillain can enter and exit the launch pad in his helicopter, which you see here on the lower left of the drawing. The supervillain needs to be able to get access to the launch pad through a helicopter. The launch pad, to move materials around and launch rockets, will need to have a working monorail in order for materials to be transported back and forth in the rocket. And by the way, all of this set needs to be big enough so we can have a huge fight between the army of evil and an army of ninja warriors led by James Bond at the end of the movie. So, here is the set that Ken Adam constructed based on what the producer, screenwriter, and director told him would be the needs of this film. So, you have a hollowed-out volcano with a fake lake on top with a retracting door, which allows a helicopter to fly in. Here is a pad for the helicopter. Here is the launch pad for the rocket. Here is the monorail going all around the set. And all of this had to be done in a way in which you wouldn't see any cables, cameras, or microphones or lights while this set is being put together. Adam decided that the best material he needed to use to construct this set would be structural steel. It was the only material that would be heavy enough or strong enough to support all of these elements, and but low cost enough, lightweight enough to be relatively cost efficient. If they used aluminum, aluminum is very strong, but it would have been very, very costly. So he decided to build this giant hollowed out volcano set out of a steel structure. So basically, a production designer, among other things, needs to be an architect and then needs to be able to supervise a construction crew to build all of this. So, basic tools of production design, as you're probably sick of hearing from me by this point, are sets, the actual physical environment that the film is going to take place in, costumes, what the actors are wearing, what are called matte paintings, and what are called miniatures. All right, let's firstly talk about miniatures because it's really the first thing that we haven't talked about. Miniatures are basically, literally miniature sets that are constructed in order again to be cost efficient. So, for instance, there's a 1935 British film of A Christmas Carol. It's actually called Scrooge. Not to be confused with the 1936 Hollywood film or the 1951 British film with Alastair Sim. But the 1935 film very often requires big exterior shots of London as it was in 1843, which is when A Christmas Carol was written. Of course, there's a little problem. London, by 1935, looks nothing like London did in 1843, but they needed these shots of the exterior of the city as part of the visual strategy of this film. So they basically built a miniature model of the exterior of the city, shot that, and on film, because you don't have the same visual perspective, you don't have the visual cues to tell you that this is a model sitting on a table and not a real city, it looks convincingly like a real city. So, miniatures are basically miniature models of sets that can be used to achieve various purposes. So, in the first King Kong film, made in 1933, for example, you have exterior shots of King Kong actually climbing the Empire State Building. So two types of miniatures were built. Firstly, a miniature of the building was placed on its side. I'm having a problem with the verb, is it lay, lie, or... But anyway, miniature of the exterior of the Empire State Building, as you can see here to the left, is placed on its side, and then basically an actor in a gorilla suit is shot climbing up the building from a distance, and because the camera is at a right angle to the side of the building, although in reality the actor is basically crawling parallel to the ground, because the camera is shifted when the film is developed, it looks like the actor is climbing up the building. King Kong himself was 18 inches tall. He himself was a miniature doll, and a process called stop-motion animation was used, in which, as we've discussed, film advances through a projector at 24 frames a second. Basically, in stop-motion animation, a model is placed on the miniature set. The one frame of film is exposed. The model is then moved very slightly. Another frame of film is exposed. The model is moved slightly again. Another frame of film is exposed. The model moves slightly again. Another frame of film is exposed. The model is moved slightly again. Another frame of film is exposed, and so on. And once the film is developed, it looks like the model is actually moving in fluid motion. So here we see, again, this miniature of the Empire State Building, now vertical, and the model of King Kong being moved up the side of the building one frame at a time. It's a painstaking process. It can sometimes take weeks to get a shot that's 30 seconds long, but it looks convincingly like King Kong is scaling the side of the building. Now, we might think, well, that was 1933, they have other techniques now. Surprise, surprise, so this is a miniature set from Star Wars. That battle scene on the Death Star at the end of the first Star Wars film, when Luke is flying down the trench, again, was a miniature. The Death Star looks vast on the screen as it expands in front of us, but in fact, it was a miniature set. This set is about, I'd say, 10 feet by about 10 feet wide, but filmed up close, and again, so that you have no other visual cues or frame of reference within the shot itself to suggest to you that this is very small. It looks very, very big. So here are the explosions that are occurring on the Death Star as the Rebel forces fly their X-Wing and Y-Wing fighters over it and shoot the Death Star with laser beams, and you see explosions on the Death Star. Here is how they achieved those explosions. Those were actually practical effects. They actually built a miniature Death Star and put explosive charges through it and captured that on film. Now, sets themselves basically have two categories besides the miniatures we've just discussed, and those are interior sets and exterior sets. We have an example from a film called Heaven's Gate of both interior and exterior sets. Now, Heaven's Gate is a pretty interesting example. One of the things we've discussed at a couple of points during the course, which will keep cropping up, is this idea that often films, as we saw in Night of the Hunter, often films on their release are commercial and critical failures. The critics hate them. Nobody goes to see them. They're considered to be a financial failure at the time of their release, and then their reputations will become rehabilitated and will be considered to be masterpieces years after their release. Citizen Kane didn't do great box office when it was released. Now it's considered to be one of the greatest movies ever made. Night of the Hunter, critical and commercial failure when it was released, now considered to be one of the greatest movies ever made. It's a Wonderful Life. I'm honestly not sure if it's on the Sight and Sound list, but also a commercial failure at its release. Now probably the most successful one of the most successful holiday/Christmas movies ever made. So often films will fail on their release, and then they will in reflection, they will be considered to be masterpieces that were simply ahead of their time. So you may be familiar with Heaven's Gate. It's one of the most notorious box office failures of all time. It actually bankrupted United Artists. Nowadays, many critics are considering it one of the great achievements of Hollywood cinema of the 1980s. And as we already know, as we discussed when we were talking about film history, the 1970s and early 1980s were themselves a period of supreme achievement in mainstream Hollywood cinema. So this film is considered by some critics, I'm one of them, to now be among the best of the best period. So, the director, Michael Cimino, was basically on the success of a film that he'd done previous to Heaven's Gate. It was called The Deer Hunter. Was basically given a blank check to do what he wanted with Heaven's Gate. So, he basically found a chunk of land in Wyoming that he was going to use for the film, and he built both interior and exterior sets. So you see here, we have a picture of the film taking place in a village square. You can see the town hall in the background. You can see the fronts of buildings and the front of the house here. He built those houses. Now, often, though, exterior sets, when we see the front of a house, often we're literally seeing a false front, and if a scene requires that an actor walk down the front of a street with the fronts of houses, the production designer will often just build the front of the house because it's cheaper to build just the front of a house than the whole of a house if the shot only requires you see the front of a house. Here is one of the interior sets that Cimino and his production designer had built for Heaven's Gate. So this is the pool hall / boarding house in the fictitious town in which the film takes place at Sweetwater, Wyoming. And just note the detail that goes into this set. So you have all of this beautiful wood paneling on the walls. Period pool table, again with carved legs. Rustic table in the foreground. Hanging candles from the ceiling, because hanging candles would have been how that area would have been illuminated, and the actor Kris Kristofferson is wearing what would have been appropriate period costume, as is the waitress who is peering at him from the side of the door. And you can see that the waitress is very meticulously wearing not just an apron, but it's an apron with some soiling on it. So great care. Again, you have a row of little wooden chairs here, a lattice here. Great care is taken to build this interior set. Firstly, so that it's functional, so it needs to have removable walls and panels so that cables and lights and reflectors and cameras and microphones can be hidden. But it also needs to achieve the look that the film needs it to achieve. So this is an interior set. Now, Ken Adam is considered to be one of the greatest production designers who has worked in the film industry. The only other production designer I can think of that is really equal in reputation to Ken Adam would be a man named John Box. John Box was the production designer on several of Sir David Lean's films, Lawrence of Arabia, for example, and A Passage to India. Ken Adam is also in that league of people considered to be at the forefront of production design. So the film we're watching, as an exemplar of production design, is Dr. Strangelove, and the production designer on Dr. Strangelove was Ken Adam. So here, what the film required from the script was an environment theoretically inside the Pentagon itself, called the War Room, where within a time of crisis or a time of national emergency, that the president and all of the president's advisors could get together and determine how to deal with the emergency. So, based on those assumptions, Ken Adam designs what is now the famous War Room set. And the War Room set has a round table, so all of the advisors and the president can communicate effectively with each other. a round ring of lights above the round table so that they can all see each other. Every seat, every position at the round table also has its own telephone so that anybody seated at the table can get any external information that they require. And here, a giant situation board of the world so that anybody sitting at that table can look at this giant situation board of the world and understand the specifics of the crisis that is unfolding. So this is the set that Ken Adam designed for the War Room in Dr. Strangelove. And again, the set is functional in that all of the cameras, all of the cables, all of the lights, all of the microphones can be hidden while achieving this illusion of the War Room. Now, Ken Adam actually got into a little trouble on Dr. Strangelove because he had to design a set of a B-52 bomber and the bomb bay of a B-52 bomber. Now, as you're going to see in the film, for the exteriors of the B-52 bomber, an effect is used combining a technique called rear screen projection, which is a special effect we'll talk about in a few weeks, with a miniature model of the B-52 bomber itself. So Ken Adam uses miniatures in this exterior shot. In the interior shots, remember that a B-52 bomber at the time the film is made, 1964, is one of the most advanced pieces of military technology in the world, and nobody wants anybody to have access to the interior of a B-52 bomber. So Adam had to guess, because the interior of a B-52 bomber is classified, nobody wants you to see what's in it, Adam had to guess practically how a B-52 bomber would be laid out. So he did know that you need certain personnel aboard a bomber, so you need a pilot, a co-pilot, a navigator, bombardiers. You need several people interacting within a B-52 bomber, so the space would need to be, the bomber would need to appear to be realistically functional to accommodate that. And he knew that the bomber would have to have certain qualities as well. So the script demanded that the bomber be able to carry 2 nuclear weapons. It was well known that B-52s carried nuclear weapons, even though nobody had actually seen the interior of one because that was classified. So Adam has to design a realistic bomb bay, a space that looks like it actually has nuclear weapons. So he didn't know what a B-52 looked like. He did know what earlier bombers used in the Second World War, B-29s, he knew what they looked like. So basically, he took all of these factors together, came up with his realistic design for what he felt was the interior of a B-52. Well, the filmmakers got contacted by, after the film was released, the filmmakers were contacted by the State Department demanding to know how the hell Ken Adam got such a good look at the interior of a B-52 when the knowledge of the interior of a B-52 was classified. The short answer was he didn't. He, through reasoning of what the functional space would have to be like and what little information he had about bombers in general, his design of the B-52 for the film is actually very close to the design of a real B-52, and the State Department was concerned that spies may have actually gotten that information to him. Now, this is a set that is actually constructed for Stanley Kubrick's film. Yes, Ken Adam worked with Stanley Kubrick very often. This is a set that's designed for Stanley Kubrick's film Barry Lyndon. Now, in Barry Lyndon, Kubrick wanted to create a film. It's set in the 18th century, so the 1700s. Kubrick wanted to create a film that really accurately duplicated the look of what it was like to live in the 18th century. In the 18th century, they didn't have electric lights, so Kubrick actually used special lenses that would allow him to film indoors in candlelit conditions with a very, very shallow depth of field. So any interior sets that are used in the film have to do two things. They have to, firstly, look like they are authentically 18th century sets. Secondly, they have to somehow allow enough light in that images can actually be captured in the interior space. So Adam built this building for the film, so as you can see, the design of the building, very consistent with 18th century. You have the brick walls and the actual supports for the roof, the struts, are constructed of wood. The walls are constructed of brick. This is consistent with what we know of the 18th century. Since this building is an outbuilding in a family estate, it has an earth floor, which is also consistent with what we know of the 18th century outbuildings in estates. They wouldn't bother to construct a wooden floor or a tiled floor. An earth floor would be absolutely fine, as the building was used as more of a storage or working space and not a living space. But you have this large archway and these windows in the background, which are there to allow sufficient light into the set so that film can be captured. So, very functional set, but also very realistic looking set as well. Here is Ken Adams' set for Dr. No, the first James Bond film, and Adam again is tasked. Dr. No has built himself his own little nuclear power station, so Ken Adam and means to achieve world domination with it. So Ken Adam is tasked with creating a realistic set for the nuclear power station based on what was known about nuclear power stations, but also a nuclear power station that would convey Dr. No's sinister plan to take over the world. So, hazmat suits, radiation suits are used for costumes because it was well known that people wore radiation suits in nuclear power plants. So you have these very functional environments, stools, where people can sit in front of banks of controls to control the nuclear power plant. Again, bank of computers around the background of the set to, again, monitor the nuclear power plant. In here, in the middle, a cooling pool, so radioactive materials can be cooled down after their fissionable material has been spent and they can no longer heat water to produce steam to produce power, and a handy globe in the middle of the nuclear power plant, so Dr. No can easily check and see how his scheme for world domination is going while he runs the nuclear power plant. So, again, you'll notice it's a very bright environment, very conducive to filmmaking, lots of light, so the camera can capture clear images, and lots of spaces where cables can be hidden, where microphones can be hidden, and you don't actually see the lights or reflectors. Here's another amusing story about Ken Adams. So, in the United States, all of the United States' gold, bars of gold, is housed in a military installation called Fort Knox. Fort Knox is a top-secret installation. The civilians are not allowed to see the interior of Fort Knox. So, again, a major set piece in the Bond film Dr. No takes place at the end of Dr. No inside of Fort Knox. James Bond has his final showdown with the villains of the film inside of Fort Knox. So Ken Adam is told he needs to build a set of Fort Knox. Well, again, nobody knows what the inside of Fort Knox looks like. So what does Ken Adam do? So again, being an architect, he reasons that, well, this is a gold repository. We do know what the exterior of the building looks like. We know that, based on the way that windows are stacked up the exterior of the building, that it has levels. So, I know nothing about the interior of the building. I know the building has levels. I know that the building is used to store gold. I know that gold is one of the heaviest materials on Earth. So, I'm going to design a building that can realistically be used not only to store gold, but to be able to move gold in the interior of the building. So, he decides firstly that, well, the best structure to move gold to different levels within a building is going to be these very, very broad leveled staircases that wind around a central metal support column. The central metal support column is going to be needed to support the weight of all of that gold. The very broad staircases and walkways and terraced levels are again going to be needed to support the weight of the gold. The broader the platform on which you're moving the gold up, the more the weight is evenly distributed, so the more that the structure will be able to absorb the weight of the gold. He also decided that it makes most sense that gold is going to be stored in individual small cells within the building. So you don't just want one huge pile of gold itself. The gold is going to weigh tons, and you will never be able to move small amounts of gold conveniently. So he designed the place in small cells, each of them holding a relatively small amount of gold bars, something like a bit of a prison environment. You'll notice that it looks like in both his sketch and the actual production still of the film. So again, you'll never guess what happens after Goldfinger is released. The U.S. military again is on the phone with Ken Adam, wondering, how did you get inside of Fort Knox and how did you know what it looks like? Again, he never got inside of Fort Knox. He never saw directly what it looked like, but from his expertise as an engineer, his understanding of what the place would have to be like in order to fulfill its function, he actually built this very realistic production design for the film. All right, let's talk a little bit about costumes. Costumes usually serve a few functions in a film. They're there to give you details of the period or setting in which the film takes place. They're usually there to add color and spectacle. Remember, especially in the 1950s and 1960s, when film is competing with television for market share, filmmakers are competing by offering the film up as a spectacular special experience. We're better than movies. We'll give you something that movies cannot deliver to you. So they want to appear to be spectacular, and costumes are often also used to give you commentaries on the characters themselves. So this again is a still from Stanley Kubrick's film Barry Lyndon, and as you'll notice here again, using special lenses, they're actually the same lenses that satellites that are used in satellites in outer space to capture images. Kubrick is able to film indoors in candlelight, as would have actually happened in the 18th century. So, all of the costumes in this used in the film are consistent with what we would be expecting upper-class 18th century people to wear in the film. Now, this is very interesting. Barry, at several points in the film, is a military officer, and, again, great care is taken for the accuracy of the costumes. And what, with particular regard to 18th century military costumes, rank and which unit that a soldier belonged to was often determined by insignia on the officer's collar and shoulders, and wrist cuffs. And Adams' costume design is accurate right down to all of these points. He actually makes sure he gets the correct insignia. Here, in this photograph of Lady Lyndon and her baby, you actually have this very ornate ostrich-plumed hat. She also wears a very ornate ostrich-plumed hat in this still as well. Her baby is in a very elaborate lace gown, also with an elaborate hat. So the costumes are here to completely immerse you and give you a sense of realistically what it's like to be in the 18th century. Now, sometimes costumes are just there to give you, along with the set, to give you color and spectacle and a rich environment. So this is a scene from an Italian film called The Leopard, made in the early 1970s. Early 1960s. My apologies. I'm off by 10 years. Beautiful film to look at. Actually, sumptuous production design. You have these beautiful gold walls, this grand ballroom with this mosaic tiled floor with beautiful colors. People are wearing beautiful uniforms with sashes. The women are all wearing hoop skirts. The scene goes on for a substantial amount of time. You're just looking at the people dancing, but because the scene itself is so pleasing to look at, it's so beautiful, it never seems to drag or get boring. So sometimes costume just gives us a sense of spectacle. Sometimes costume is used to very deliberately signal things about characters to us. So this is a still from Charlie Chaplin's film City Lights. The character he plays is a little tramp. We see, firstly, that his pants are way, way, way too big. They're baggy. And they're actually held up by a rope and have holes in them, although it's a little difficult to see that in his still. The jacket is way, way, way too tight. You'll notice that it's done up by one button, and it's badly splaying at the bottom. It is not well fitted as well, and again the jacket is torn in a couple of places. So this tells us immediately that he's a hobo, a tramp, he's poor. He also has his little cane and his little hat. And here's where costume combines with performance to give you information about this character. Despite the fact that he is a little tramp, and you'll also notice by the way, he has a little bow tie, which he has tied well. What these elements of costume, intertwined with performance, are telling us that he is a little tramp, he has no money, he's out on the streets, but he has never lost his sense of dignity. Whenever he insists on walking with his cane, his walking stick, he tips his hat to people as he goes by, and he has this very meticulously tied bow tie. And it signals to us, firstly, that, yes, he's very, very poor, and secondly, that he still has a sense of dignity, a sense of worth about himself, despite the fact that he's living in a state of extreme poverty. So here's an example in which costume tells us things we need to know about the characters. This is an early scene from the scene you're going to see in conjunction with, or as I should say, as an exemplar of great production design, Dr. Strangelove. So the location is clearly a motel room, and we see these two characters, and we can look at how they're costumed. So we see a young woman in her early 20s. She is in a bikini in a motel room. We see a much older man. He's probably in his 40s or 50s. He is in a bathing suit with a loud Hawaiian shirt, wide open. His gut is sticking out over his bathing suit and out of his shirt. And what does this costuming tell us about the characters of the people? She is also identified in the scene as his secretary, and she is identified as his boss. So they're up to something a little shady in a motel room, is what is implied by the interaction of the costume, the set, and the performances. this character on the right, he plays a general named General Turgidson. This is our first introduction to him, and it very much sets the tone by which we're going to interpret his character all throughout the film, despite the fact that for the majority of the film we see him dressed in a military uniform. Our previous knowledge of him appearing this way taints our later perception of him throughout the film, and that's quite deliberate. Now, prior to digital technologies being available, matte paintings were often used to extend the scope and size of sets, and matte paintings rely on a visual effect called trompe-l'oeil. If I were to literally translate the phrase trompe-l'oeil from French into English, the literal meaning of the phrase trompe-l'oeil is to deceive the eye. So trompe-l'oeil is a visual effect in which lines are used to actually make you think that you're seeing a three-dimensional space when you're actually looking at a two-dimensional matte painting. So to give you an example of trompe-l'oeil effects, again from a little independent film I know called Star Wars. So here is a trompe-l'oeil effect from the first Star Wars movie. So what the production designer did was to create a small set about 10 feet high of a power bank within a place called the Death Star. It's a space station, and one of the central characters of the film, you can see him standing here. He's about 5 or 6 feet off the ground. He has to disable a tractor beam, so he needs to sneak up to this power station, pull a couple of levers, and disable the tractor beam. Now, the effect that they actually wanted in the finished film was that he would be standing on a platform literally hundreds of feet in the air displaying this tractor beam. So what was done was a glass matte painting was used, and you can see that this glass matte painting has a lot of converging angular lines. The effect that these converging angular lines give us, although they're painted on a flat surface, they give us an illusion of depth and height where there isn't any. So, using a technique called traveling mattes, which I'll discuss further when we talk about visual effects, the image taken on the actual set is combined with the image of the glass matte painting to give you this sense that the actor is on a platform hundreds of feet in the air as he disables the tractor beam. So that is called trompe-l'oeil, meaning to deceive the eye. Now, the design concept for the film is a central idea that organizes the way that all sets and costumes are built, dressed, and photographed. Now, the matte painting I just showed you from Star Wars was literally a physical painting using paint on glass. Now that we have digital computer technology, we basically use the same techniques. We simply do them electronically rather than physically. So even though we're now rarely making paintings onto glass to achieve these effects, what we're doing is we're creating digital environments, virtual reality environments within computers, and just as done in Star Wars here, integrating the image in the virtual reality environment with the image of what is photographed to create an effect of a real environment. So as I've said before, film sets are getting now much, much smaller. Very often film sets are the size of our classroom. The walls are painted entirely green, and any action that is captured within the film set in an entirely green environment is now simply integrated into a digital environment and can create almost any environment that the actors want to generalize. So, Roughly speaking, though, now that we're working with digital effects, the process is pretty much the same as when we were working with practical effects. There's a process by which the digital production designers are going to pre-visualize the look of the film with the director, the producer, and the screenwriters. They're going to go through a process of digital grading, so rather than coming up with all of these sketches and drawings, they're going to actually digitally produce rough models of the sort of sets, costumes, and props that they want to use in the film. Then everything is going to be shot now on a green screen soundstage, not much bigger than our classroom, and a CGI environment is going to be added in around the characters. So here's an example of a CGI environment. So everybody's seen the film Life of Pi, and you love those spectacular scenes on the ocean when Pi is in the boat with the tiger Richard Parker. The ocean extends for miles around him, as we can see on the right, and there are those beautiful night scenes when you see a blue whale shoot up through iridescent plankton. All right. On the left, this is where Life of Pi was shot. It was shot in a studio tank with the walls painted blue. The studio tank is not much bigger than a public swimming pool. All of this, including the tiger, is added in after the film is completed digitally. Here's another interesting example from a film called Zodiac, made by David Fincher in the early 2000s. You'll notice that the slide did mention Zodiac. So, Zodiac is a film set in San Francisco in the early 1970s. One of the central architectural landmarks of San Francisco now is a building called the Transamerica Tower. It's an office building, the Transamerica Pyramid, I should say. It's an office building built in the shape of a pyramid, houses the corporate offices of the Transamerica Company, a major American insurance company. So, there was just one little problem when they were shooting the film. They wanted to use exterior shots of San Francisco in the movie, but the problem was the movie is being made in the early 2000s. It's set 30 years earlier in San Francisco. The Transamerica Tower, at the time that the film is depicting, is only half built. Traditionally, what filmmakers have done when they're shooting in a city, but the landscape in the city has altered to the effect that people would recognize buildings that weren't there 30 years ago and say, hey, that building shouldn't be there. It wasn't built at the time this movie takes place, is that the filmmakers would either build a tabletop model, as they did in that earlier version of A Christmas Carol I told you about, if they wanted an extreme long shot or an establishing shot, or they would shoot exteriors so that you could only see the fronts of buildings, or maybe they would use medium shots so you couldn't see more than the first 6 to 8 feet of the height of a building. So you would just see the building 6 to 8 feet off the ground. There's a film made by Samuel Fuller called The Big Red One, in which he recreates the D-Day invasion, but he's got a problem. He's only got about 20 actors. So the films when the actors are supposedly storming the beaches of Normandy and making their way up the cliffs of Normandy, they're shot very, very close to the cliffs so that the 20 actors seem to be entirely filling the frame, so that you have this sense of the frame just packed with actors, but the shot is so close against the cliff, you don't realize there's not that many of them, and you just have a few people against a giant beach. But what the digital technology enabled the filmmakers of Zodiac to do was to go back through the film, frame by frame, isolate any shots, including the Transamerica Tower, and digitally alter them so that you could see, so that rather than seeing the completed building, you see the half-completed building and its superstructure as it was in 1974 when it's supposed to take place. Another example of this is given in the film Captain Marvel, if anybody saw it this year. Samuel Jackson appears in the film. Samuel Jackson is now, I think, in his 70s. The film is supposed to take place 30 years ago, 35 years ago, in the mid-1980s. And basically what the filmmakers did was have Samuel Jackson play the same role that he plays in all of the other Marvel films, but digitally go through the film frame by frame and make him look frame by frame like he was 30 years younger. And it's actually quite a seamless effect. It's actually, in both cases, it's quite remarkable. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed our talk on production design. I look forward to seeing you in class. Please do email me if you have any questions.